Donald Trump spent 2 days in Beijing and returned describing the outcome as a major package agreement. The headline centered on $17 billion in agricultural purchases. But beneath the soybean and beef commitments sat the issue that could shape American technological strength for the next decade: rare earth access. China currently controls about 60% of worldwide rare earth mining capacity and nearly 90% of processing operations. In October 2025, Beijing turned that dominance into leverage. Export restrictions were imposed, sending disruptions across American defense contractors, semiconductor firms, and electric vehicle manufacturers. The White House fact sheet released after the Beijing summit stated that China would cooperate with United States regulators to restore access to rare earth materials. China's own official statement did not confirm that commitment. An analyst from the Conference Board's China Center stated there was a complete absence of details regarding which export controls would actually be loosened. Trump exchanged agricultural concessions for a rare earth commitment that Beijing itself never officially acknowledged. The broader agreement announced after the summit on May 14th and 15th of 2026 immediately raised questions, because Washington and Beijing described the same meetings in very different ways. Trump arrived in Beijing for the first presidential trip to China in nearly a decade. 2 days of discussions with Xi Jinping produced what the White House described as a sweeping set of commitments. The official White House fact sheet published on May 17, 2026, outlined the key outcomes. China agreed to purchase at least $17 billion annually in American agricultural goods during 2026, 2027, and 2028. Alongside soybean commitments first made in Busan during October 2025, Beijing renewed expired approvals for more than 400 American beef facilities and added additional listings. China also resumed poultry imports from the United States, states officially confirmed free from highly pathogenic avian influenza. Most critically, the White House declared that China would address American access to rare earth elements considered essential for automobile, semiconductor, and smartphone production. Beijing's official statement presented a different version of the summit. China's readout focused on tariff reductions from the American side, confirmed agricultural purchase agreements, and emphasized broader frameworks for economic and trade cooperation. But the Chinese government statement never mentioned rare earths, not once. Washington announced that rare earth access had been secured. Beijing offered no such confirmation. One summit in Beijing produced two completely different descriptions of the same agreement. Alfredo Montufar Helu, senior advisor at the China Center of the Conference Board, addressed the issue directly. He stated that while China's latest statement appeared encouraging, expectations should remain limited because there were no concrete details identifying which rare earth export restrictions would actually be relaxed beyond magnets. The gap surrounding rare earths was not a small diplomatic omission. It represented one of the most significant economic security questions facing the United States in 2026. China accounts for roughly 60% of global rare earth mineral production and processes around 90% of those materials into the refined forms required for modern technology. Elements such as neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, gallium, germanium, antimony, and others are not optional pieces of advanced manufacturing systems. They are fundamental components. Every permanent magnet used in electric vehicle motors relies on neodymium and dysprosium refined in China. Every semiconductor fabrication plant depends on gallium and germanium compounds that Beijing overwhelmingly controls. Every missile guidance platform, radar system, and advanced drone uses components derived from rare earth processing infrastructure linked to China. The United States Department of Defense previously identified rare earth materials as a critical weakness inside the national security supply chain. The American defense industrial base depends heavily on materials that Beijing can restrict through regulatory action alone. In October 2025, China demonstrated exactly that capability. Beijing announced broad export controls targeting gallium, germanium, antimony, graphite, and rare earth magnets. The restrictions focused directly on materials heavily relied upon by American defense firms and technology manufacturers. The move immediately created supply chain uncertainty for Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and major semiconductor producers operating across the United States. General Motors, Ford, and other automakers preparing electric vehicle production plans also faced immediate concern over material access. The export controls were not random. They were not reactive. They represented a deliberate demonstration of leverage, timed alongside trade negotiations to show Washington how much economic pressure Beijing could apply without military action. Meanwhile, the tariff concessions granted by the United States throughout the Geneva, London, and Beijing negotiation process were significant and uneven. Under the Geneva Agreement reached in May 2025, Washington reduced tariffs on Chinese goods from 145% to 30%. The reduction marked a dramatic reversal from the tariff escalation Trump had launched only weeks earlier during Liberation Day. Even at 30%, tariffs on Chinese imports remained elevated compared to historical norms. Before the trade war period, the rate stood near 12%, but the new level remained less than 1/4 of the 145% peak. Chinese products are now entering the American market at far lower costs compared to the height of the tariff confrontation. Manufacturers in the United States that expected long-term elevated tariffs to force supply chains back onto American soil are now confronting a different reality. The tariff protection they believed was necessary to make domestic manufacturing financially viable has been sharply reduced. In return for those tariff cuts, Washington obtained 3 outcomes: a 90-day tariff suspension structure, agricultural purchasing promises from China, and, according to the White House, though not officially acknowledged by Beijing, a broad commitment related to rare earth access. Joseph Glauber, Senior Research Fellow Emeritus at the International Food Policy Research Institute, placed the agricultural portion of the arrangement into perspective. The trade conflict that began in 2018 ultimately cost American agriculture more than $27 billion. Soybeans represented 71% of those annualized losses, helping competing exporters permanently secure portions of the market. The effects of the first trade war permanently reshaped global soybean trade routes. Brazil gained Chinese soybean market share during that period and never completely surrendered it afterward. The annual $17 billion commitment does not recover what disappeared in 2018. Instead, it represents a partial and time-limited arrangement denominated in dollars that gives Beijing broad flexibility to purchase below expectations while still claiming technical compliance. The record from the Phase 1 agreement proves that concern is not hypothetical. It is documented history. In January 2020, Washington and Beijing finalized Phase 1 of the original Trump trade agreement. China pledged to purchase $200 billion in American products and services over 2 years. The targets included $80 billion in manufactured goods, $50 billion in energy, and $32 billion in agricultural products above 2017 baseline levels. By the conclusion of 2021, China had completed only around 57% to 58% of its total Phase 1 obligations. Agricultural imports performed better than the other categories, reaching approximately 83% of the stated commitment, but still failed to achieve the official target. The 2026 arrangement is structured differently. Instead of specific volume requirements, the framework relies on dollar values. That approach gives Beijing wider room for interpretation compared with the volume-based structure used during Phase 1. The agreement also extends only through 2028. That limited 2-year window gives China substantial flexibility to meet obligations when politically useful and underdeliver when circumstances change. The United States trade deficit with China reached $295 billion in 2024. The $17 billion agricultural promise equals roughly 5.7% of that yearly deficit. Even if China fully complies, which previous history suggests is uncertain, the agreement only addresses a small portion of the structural imbalance that American manufacturers, labor groups, and policymakers have long identified as the central issue in the bilateral trade relationship. At the same time, the rare earth commitment, the single point in the agreement tied directly to national security vulnerability, appears in the official statement of only one negotiating side. The timeline surrounding rare earth controls explains why the gap between Washington's claims and Beijing's silence may be the most financially important detail from the entire Beijing summit. It also explains why American companies depending on resolution remain uneasy despite the White House fact sheet. In October 2025, China's Commerce Ministry introduced export controls covering gallium, germanium, antimony, graphite, and rare earth magnets. The restrictions did not completely stop exports. Instead, they required export licenses, adding a bureaucratic mechanism that allowed Beijing to approve, delay, or reject shipments individually. The effect was immediate and severe. American defense contractors reported supply chain disruptions within weeks. Semiconductor manufacturers dependent on gallium compounds for compound semiconductors used in radar systems, satellite communications, and 5G infrastructure suddenly faced procurement uncertainty that spot market purchases could not solve. The licensing system created a choke point rather than a total shutdown. But Beijing controlled the valve completely. During the Busan summit in October 2025, the White House announced that China had paused rare earth export controls for 1 year by issuing what officials described as a general license for American buyers. That general license can be revoked at any moment. No congressional approval is required to withdraw it. No international treaty process is necessary. Beijing can restore the controls through a regulatory announcement, exactly as it demonstrated when the restrictions were first imposed. The White House fact sheet released after the Beijing summit stated that China would work with United States regulators to restore rare earth access. The language focused on future process rather than completed outcomes. Working with regulators does not equal restored access. It represents an agreement to continue discussions. The industries most exposed to the uncertainty are now caught between what Washington claimed and what Beijing officially confirmed. The automobile sector faces the most immediate exposure. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis have all committed to electric vehicle production goals dependent on rare earth permanent magnets, specifically neodymium iron boron magnets, at volumes. Impossible to source outside Chinese processing systems within any time frame shorter than 5 to 7 years. The United States has been trying to establish domestic rare earth processing capacity. MP Materials currently operates the Mountain Pass mine in California, the only active rare earth mine in the United States, but extraction is only the beginning of the process. Turning rare earth oxides into the refined metals and alloys required by technology, manufacturers demands chemical processing systems that take years to construct. It also requires specialized expertise China has spent 3 decades developing. Even if every rare earth mine in the United States operated at maximum output today, American processing capability could satisfy only a limited share of current industrial demand. The semiconductor sector carries the sharpest national security implications. Gallium arsenide and gallium nitride compounds used in radar systems, missile seekers, electronic warfare equipment, and satellite communications do not have commercially viable non-Chinese supply chains at the scale required by the American defense industrial base. Lockheed Martin's F-35 program, Raytheon missile platforms, and Northrop Grumman radar systems all carry varying levels of exposure to Chinese-controlled gallium supplies. The Department of Defense Supply Chain Review identified this issue as a Tier 1 national security vulnerability, and the agreement that was supposed to address that vulnerability produced a rare earth commitment confirmed by the White House, but left unverified by Beijing. The annual $17 billion commitment is based on dollar value rather than physical volume. That distinction was not accidental. The Busan Agreement reached in October 2025 relied on volume targets, 12 million tons of soybeans for the 2025 to 2026 marketing year, 25 million tons annually for 3 years. But the Beijing arrangement announced in May 2026 shifted to a dollar-based structure. That change carries major practical consequences. When commitments are volume-based, the purchaser must buy the specified quantity regardless of price fluctuations. When agreements are denominated in dollars, the buyer can reduce physical purchases if prices increase while still technically satisfying the financial target. Soybean prices move constantly according to global supply and demand conditions. If soybean prices rise 15% from current levels, China can purchase 15% fewer tons while still claiming compliance with the $17 billion commitment. The actual amount reaching American farmers, the planted acreage, harvested bushels, and farm income across Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and every major soybean-producing state depends on volume rather than dollar totals. Chinese negotiators understood that difference clearly. The shift from volume commitments in the October 2025 agreement to dollar-denominated commitments in the May 2026 framework represented a negotiating concession that the White House fact sheet did not emphasize. But grain traders comparing both agreements recognized the difference immediately. The historical record surrounding these commitments provides the broader context. The Phase 1 trade agreement, signed in January 2020, committed China to purchasing $200 billion in American goods over 2 years. China ultimately fulfilled around 57% to 58% of the overall target. But economists studying Chinese trade commitments under political pressure have documented a repeated pattern of promises exceeding actual delivery. Institutions including the Peterson Institute for International Economics have examined that trend extensively. The structural reason is relatively straightforward. Chinese state-owned enterprises responsible for executing these purchases are not purely commercial organizations. They balance market considerations with political direction. When political pressure during a summit or trade negotiation requires a purchase commitment, the pledge gets announced. But when the pressure to fully execute the purchases weakens, when pricing conditions become unfavorable, when domestic substitutes are available, or when additional leverage opportunities emerge, actual purchasing performance declines. Piper Sandler analyst Andy Lear described the Busan Agreement in direct terms. China made similar commitments involving soybeans and fentanyl during Trump's first term and failed to completely fulfill them. His conclusion was equally direct. He stated that it was doubtful Trump obtained anything structural in exchange for lowering tariffs. That assessment focused on Busan. The Beijing Agreement added $17 billion in agricultural promises tied to dollar values, along with a rare earth commitment that Beijing itself has not officially confirmed. All of this came on top of a tariff structure already reduced from 145% to 30%. The $295 billion yearly trade deficit between the United States and China remains the underlying structural reality. Neither $17 billion in soybean purchases nor an unconfirmed rare earth process commitment changes that imbalance. The deficit exists because American consumers continue purchasing Chinese manufactured products at volumes no agricultural agreement can offset. Reducing a $295 billion structural trade gap would require reshoring manufacturing, rebuilding domestic supply chains, and making American production costs competitive with Chinese alternatives. None of those outcomes automatically emerge from a 3-year agricultural purchasing arrangement denominated in dollars instead of volume. Nor do they emerge from a rare earth commitment that China's government has not formally acknowledged in its own summit readout. American farmers could receive partial and temporary benefits if Beijing fulfills the $17 billion commitment near the announced level. American technology firms and defense contractors would benefit far more significantly if the rare earth access commitment became specific, enforceable, and irreversible. The first outcome depends entirely on China's willingness to buy. The second depends on Beijing officially confirming a commitment it still has not publicly acknowledged. Both dependencies remain entirely under China's control. If this breakdown helped clarify what sits beneath the headline numbers, share it with someone following the United States-China trade relationship. And if the details inside this agreement changed your understanding of the Beijing summit, continue following the story as more information emerges. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.